The calm before the storm. The sun dipped low over the African savanna, casting golden hues across the village's thatched rooftops. Birds called out in the evening air, their songs blending with the distant roars of lions prowling in the tall grass. In this small, close-knit community, Jabari and Zalika lived a life of quiet resilience. Jabari had once been a legend, a man who could tame the wild with nothing but his voice and steady hands. People traveled from distant lands to watch him handle lions, elephants, and even the feared black mamba. But all of that changed in an instant. A miscalculated step, a startled beast, and a single tragic moment had left him paralyzed from the waist down. Now, confined to a wheelchair, Jabari refused to let his past slip away. Despite Zalika's protest, he still kept animals, snakes coiled in wooden boxes, a hawk perched in the courtyard, and a young hyena that followed him like a loyal dog. The village whispered about him, calling him stubborn, reckless. But to Jabari, these creatures were not threats, they were his history, his heritage. Zalika, a dedicated schoolteacher, had taken on the burden of providing for their family. She loved Jabari fiercely, but she feared for their young son, Kofi. At just 6 years old, the boy had already begun mimicking his father, reaching for the snakes with unafraid hands, listening to the old stories of how man and beast could understand one another. One evening, as Zalika set out dinner, she saw Kofi crouched by his father's wheelchair, his tiny hands extended toward the wooden crate where Jabari's prize snake, a massive, black-spotted python, lay caught inside. Jabari, Zalika said, her voice edged with worry, you need to stop this. Jabari sighed, his dark eyes steady. He must learn, Zalika. It is in his blood. In his blood, she echoed, frustration rising. He is a child. What if he gets bitten? What if one day, one of those animals? Jabari cut her off, his tone calm but firm. Fear is what makes a man weak. Kofi must understand them, respect them. That is the only way he will ever be safe. Zalika clenched her jaw. She knew arguing would lead nowhere. Jabari was as unshakable as the earth itself. But deep in her heart, an uneasy feeling took root. A storm was coming. And this time, she feared that even Jabari's wisdom would not be enough to keep them safe. The secret unfolds. The village swayed with the rhythm of daily life, women carrying baskets of maize on their heads, children running barefoot through the dusty roads, elders exchanging wisdom beneath the shade of the baobab tree. But inside Jabari's home, a storm was beginning to brew. While Zalika spent her days teaching at the village school, Jabari remained at home with Kofi, watching over the animals and passing down his knowledge. Kofi, with his father's same sharp instincts, listened intently as Jabari spoke of how the ancestors had once walked alongside the beast, treating them as brothers rather than threats. But on this particular afternoon, an unexpected visitor arrived. Safina. She moved like a shadow from the past, graceful, confident, carrying an air of danger that once drew Jabari to her like a moth to a flame. She had been his first love, a woman as wild as the creatures he tamed. But when Jabari's accident left him bound to a wheelchair, she had disappeared, vanishing into the city's bright lights. Now, after all these years, she was back. Safina, Jabari murmured, surprise flickering in his voice. She smiled, a slow, knowing smile. You look good, Jabari. Strong. Jabari exhaled, his grip tightening on the wooden armrest of his wheelchair. He should have sent her away. He should have told her that his life was different now, that he had a wife who had stood by him through the worst of times. But instead, he allowed her to stay. At first, their meetings were innocent, just old friends reminiscing. But Safina was a temptress, and soon, the lines between past and present blurred. She whispered to him about the life they could have had, about the adventures he left behind. She ran her fingers over his calloused hands, reminding him of the man he used to be. While Jabari was lost in the echoes of old passion, safety in the home began to slip. Kofi, left more to his own devices, grew bolder. He played with the snakes unsupervised, mirroring his father's actions but lacking the caution that years of experience had given Jabari. The boy no longer waited for his father's instructions, he reached into the crates, testing his bravery. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Zalika returned home to find Kofi crouched near the largest snake enclosure, the wooden lid slightly ajar. Her heart lurched. Kofi! Kofi jumped, startled. He turned to face his mother, his small hands gripping the sides of the crate. His expression wasn't one of fear but frustration. Baba says I must not be afraid. I was only looking. Zalika's eyes flickered to Jabari, who sat nearby, distracted, his focus locked on Safina, who leaned against the doorway with a smirk. The air thickened with tension. Zalika turned to Jabari, her voice trembling. What is she doing here? Jabari hesitated. We were just talking. Talking. Zalika's voice sharpened. While our son plays with death. Safina chuckled softly. Relax, Zalika. He is his father's son. He will be fine. But Zalika saw what Jabari refused to see, the danger creeping in, not just from the animals, but from the woman who had slithered her way back into their lives like a serpent. That night, as the family ate in silence, Zalika watched Jabari from across the table, the flickering lantern casting long shadows on his face. Something was changing. And she was terrified of what would come next, the turning point. The air in the village had shifted. The skies felt heavier, the wind carried whispers of change, and inside Jabari's home, an unseen danger slithered ever closer. For days, Safina had embedded herself deeper into Jabari's life, charming him with memories of who he used to be. She laughed at his old stories, spoke of wild places he had once longed to see, and traced her fingers along his arms as if reminding him that he was still the same man. Zalika felt the distance widening, but she did not yet know how deep the betrayal ran. And in the shadows, Kofi watched. He saw the way his father's eyes lingered on Safina, how his mother's smile had faded, replaced by a quiet, cautious sadness. But Kofi was too young to understand the complexities of adult hearts. What he did understand was the way Safina looked at him sometimes, curious, calculating. Like she was waiting for something. Then, the storm broke. It started like any other afternoon. Zalika, feeling unwell, left school early, deciding to surprise her family with a home-cooked meal. She walked the familiar dirt path home, unaware of the danger waiting ahead. Meanwhile, inside the house, Safina's jealousy burned hotter with every passing day. She saw the love Jabari still had for Zalika, the way his fingers hesitated before touching her, the guilt in his eyes. It made her seethe. She wanted to prove something, to show that she had more influence, more power. And what better way than to strike at the very heart of Zalika's world? Do you want to be brave, Kofi? Safina asked, her voice smooth as silk. Kofi looked up from the dirt floor where he was playing with a small wooden carving of a lion. I am brave, he said proudly. Safina smiled. Braver than your father. Kofi hesitated, his little brow furrowing. Baba is the bravest. Then prove it, she whispered, her eyes flicking to the largest snake crate. The lid was slightly unlatched, left open just enough. Inside, the massive python coiled in the shadows, its thick, muscular body shifting ever so slightly. Kofi's breath caught in his throat, but Safina leaned closer. Your father tamed beast, Kofi. If you want to be like him, you must show no fear. The boy swallowed hard, his heart pounding. He stepped forward, reaching for the crate. His tiny fingers grazed the wooden edge as he peered inside. The python, sensing movement, stirred. And then it happened, too fast, too sudden. A sharp hiss. A blur of movement. Kofi yelped as the snake's head shot up, its body coiling tighter, its forked tongue flicking dangerously close. He stumbled back, his small foot catching on the edge of a stool. He fell, hitting the ground hard, tears welling in his eyes. Jabari turned at the sound, his eyes widening. Kofi! In an instant, he wheeled himself forward, his strong arms moving with practiced speed. He reached for his son, pulling him away just as the snake slithered closer, its thick body gliding over the dirt floor. Safina remained still, watching with an eerie, satisfied calm. The door burst open. Zalika stood there, her chest rising and falling, her eyes taking in the scene, the snake, her terrified son, Jabari's panicked face. And then, her gaze landed on Safina, standing far too close, her lips curved in an almost smile. Silence. Then, in a voice trembling with rage, Zalika asked, "What is she doing here?" Jabari opened his mouth, but no words came. Kofi, still clutching his father, sobbed. "Mama, I was brave. I tried to be like Boba." The truth hit Zalika like a crushing weight. The unspoken moments, the stolen glances, the way Jabari had been slipping away from her. And now, her son, nearly harmed, all because of the woman standing in their home like she belonged. Zalika's hands clenched into fists. "Get out." Safina tilted her head, amusement flickering in her dark eyes. "I was just helping him learn." Zalika's voice was a low, dangerous growl. "I said, get out." Jabari, finally finding his voice, turned to Safina. "Go," he said, the spell she had cast over him breaking in an instant. Safina's smirk faded. She gave one last glance at Jabari, perhaps hoping he would stop her, but he didn't. Without another word, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the evening light. Zalika knelt beside Kofi, gathering him in her arms, pressing her lips to his forehead. "You are safe," she whispered, though her heart thundered with the knowledge that safety had almost been lost. She turned to Jabari, her eyes filled with betrayal and something far worse, disappointment. "You let this happen." Jabari swallowed hard, unable to look at her. Outside, the sun sank behind the horizon. And inside, the foundation of their family had begun to crumble. The fallout. The silence in the house was heavier than the humid night air. Only the distant sounds of the savannah, the rustling of dry leaves, the distant roar of a lion, broke the crushing stillness between Zalika and Jabari. Kofi had finally fallen asleep, his small body curled against Zalika's side, but his mother remained awake, staring at the flickering lantern, her thoughts dark and tangled. Jabari sat in his wheelchair across the room, his hands resting on the wooden arms, but he hadn't moved in hours. He had always believed himself unshakable, a man who could command even the wildest of creatures. But now, he was faced with something far more terrifying, his wife's heartbreak, his son's fear, the weight of his own failure. Zalika broke the silence first. "I trusted you," she whispered, her voice raw. Jabari closed his eyes, exhaling shakily. "I never meant." "Don't." She cut him off, shaking her head. "You let her into our home, into our son's life. You let her put him in danger." Her voice rose, the anger bubbling up after days, weeks of suspicion. "I begged you to stop. I told you this was dangerous, but you didn't listen. You never listen." Jabari flinched, his hands tightening into fists. He wanted to argue, to tell her that it wasn't like that, that he had been blinded, foolish, lost in the past. But how could he defend himself when Kofi had nearly been hurt? The weight of his choices crushed him. Outside, whispers had begun to spread through the village. People talked in hushed voices about the woman who had come back from Jabari's past, about the near tragedy in his home, about the way Zalika had ordered Safina to leave. The village was small, and secrets never stayed buried for long. And so, slowly, people began to turn away. The elders, once proud of Jabari's legacy, now shook their heads when they passed by. The men who had once admired him stopped visiting, their silence heavy with quiet judgment. Even the children, who used to gather to hear his stories about the animals, no longer came. Jabari felt the shift like a slow-burning fire, consuming everything. Then, just as quickly as she had arrived, Safina was gone. She left before dawn, slipping away into the early morning mist. She didn't say goodbye, didn't try to fight for what she had started. There was nothing left to fight for. Jabari had made his choice, whether he realized it too late or not. When Zalika awoke that morning and saw the empty space where Safina had once stood, she felt no relief, only exhaustion. The damage was already done. That night, as she packed a small bag with Kofi's clothes, Jabari finally spoke. "You're leaving?" Zalika didn't stop folding the fabric. "I need time." "Kofi needs time." Jabari's throat tightened. "Zalika. I made a mistake. I see that now." She stopped, meeting his eyes for the first time since their fight. There was pain in her gaze, but also something colder, something that scared him more than anger. Disbelief. "You didn't just make a mistake, Jabari. You broke us." Her words cut deeper than any wound he had ever suffered. She took Kofi's hand, lifting the small bag onto her shoulder. "I will send someone for the rest of our things." Jabari's breath hitched. "Please." Zalika hesitated at the doorway, looking back at the man she had once believed was unshakable. "If you truly want to fix this, you need to ask yourself, was it ever about the animals? Or was it about your own pride?" And with that, she walked away, disappearing into the night with Kofi at her side. Jabari was left alone, the house echoing with emptiness. The village had turned its back on him. His family was gone. And for the first time in his life, Jabari, the great animal tamer, the man who had once commanded the respect of beasts, realized he had no idea how to tame his own heart. Redemption begins. The sun rose over the village, casting golden light over the fields and thatched rooftops. Birds called out in the morning air, their songs blending with the distant murmur of voices. Life moved on, as it always did, but for Zalika and Kofi, it was the start of something new. For the first time in years, Zalika felt truly in control. She had spent too long living in the shadow of Jabari's past, worrying about his choices, fighting for their son's safety. Now, she was done waiting for change. She would be the change. With the help of the village women, she found a small home on the other side of the village, far from the whispers and memories of betrayal. It was simple, a single room, a thatched roof, a sturdy wooden door, but it was hers. More importantly, it was safe. The community, seeing her strength, rallied around her. The elders praised her for standing firm. The women brought food, clothes, and warm embraces. Even the men, who had once admired Jabari, now showed quiet respect for Zalika. And then, the animals. The village had never approved of the dangerous creatures Jabari kept, but now, they took action. Together, the men helped remove the snakes and return them to the wild, carefully releasing them far beyond the outskirts of the village. The hyena, now untamed and restless, was taken to a sanctuary where it could roam freely. For the first time, Zalika and Kofi could sleep peacefully, without the fear of what lurked in the corners of their home. But what of Jabari? He had watched everything from a distance, the way the village embraced Zalika, the way Kofi laughed freely without the weight of danger hanging over him. He saw how the people who once respected him now turned to her, how his name had become one spoken with disappointment. At first, he felt bitterness. He told himself that they had all abandoned him, that they didn't understand. But the truth clawed at him, forcing him to see what he had refused to admit for so long. This was his fault. For too long, he had clung to the past, to his glory days, to his pride, to the belief that he alone knew what was best. He had ignored the people who mattered most. And now, he was alone. But he refused to let that be his end. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jabari rode himself to the village center. The elders were gathered, speaking in hushed voices. The younger men worked in the fields. The women prepared the evening meal. Life went on. Jabari took a deep breath and did something he had never done before. He humbled himself. He went to the elders and offered his hands, not as a tamer, not as a man of pride, but as a man who wished to serve. At first, they hesitated. But then, slowly, they accepted. And so, Jabari began his transformation. He worked in the fields, helping where he could, teaching young boys the ways of the land instead of the ways of the wild. He assisted in repairing homes, fixing broken fences, mending thatched roofs. He became a quiet presence in the community, not demanding respect, but earning it. But the hardest part of his journey was Zalika. She did not make it easy for him. And why should she? She watched him from afar, saw his efforts, but remained guarded. She had seen the damage he was capable of. She would not allow herself or Kofi to be hurt again. One evening, Jabari found himself outside her small home. He hesitated before knocking, his heart heavy with the weight of everything he had done. When she opened the door, her eyes were unreadable. "I do not expect you to forgive me," he said quietly. "But I need you to know that I see it now. I see all of it. And I am sorry." Zalika studied him for a long moment. Then, with a quiet nod, she simply said, "We will see." And for Jabari, that was enough. For now. A new beginning. The days passed, turning into weeks, and though the wounds of the past could not be erased, they began to heal. Zalika and Jabari did not rush toward reconciliation. There were no grand gestures, no sudden declarations of love regained. Instead, there were small moments, acts of quiet understanding that slowly built a bridge between them. Jabari continued his work in the village, proving himself not just to others, but to himself. He no longer sought admiration or recognition. He simply wanted to do good. He repaired broken tools, helped the elders carry heavy loads, and took time to listen, truly listen, to those around him. And Zalika saw it. She saw the man she had once loved, not in the past he clung to, but in the present he was working to build. One evening, as she walked home from school, she found Jabari sitting outside her home, carving a small wooden figure. He had once been a master of taming animals, but now, he worked with his hands in a different way. "I made something for Kofi," he said, holding up the carving. It was a lion, but not one of dominance or aggression. It was peaceful, standing tall, its gaze forward as if looking toward a future filled with promise. Zalika took it, running her fingers over the smooth surface. She looked at Jabari, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't see the man who had betrayed her. She saw the man who was trying to be better. Their relationship was not what it had been before. It might never be. But perhaps, that was a good thing. They were building something new, something stronger. Kofi's future. Kofi, once eager to follow in his father's footsteps, had changed too. The incident with the snake had not left him fearful, but it had opened his eyes. He no longer wanted to control the wild creatures. Instead, he wanted to understand them. With Zalika's encouragement, he spent more time learning about the land, studying the animals not as things to be tamed, but as creatures to be respected. One afternoon, he stood with Jabari by the village outskirts, watching the savannah stretch endlessly before them. "Baba," Kofi said, his voice filled with quiet determination, "I don't want to be an animal tamer like you." Jabari looked at his son, expecting to feel disappointment. But instead, he felt pride. Kofi's journey would be different from his own. And that was okay. Then what do you want to be? Jabari asked. Kofi smiled. I want to help protect them. I want to make sure they are safe, just like Mama made sure I was safe. Jabari nodded, his heart swelling. Then that is what you will do. Closure, strength in unity. As the sun set over the village, Zalika, Jabari, and Kofi sat outside, sharing a simple meal. The past still lingered, but it no longer defined them. They had been broken, but they had found a way to rebuild, not as the family they once were, but as the family they were meant to be. Zalika glanced at Jabari, then at Kofi, and finally at the horizon stretching before them. We have come a long way, she said softly. Jabari nodded. And we still have a long way to go. Zalika smiled, not with blind forgiveness, but with the quiet strength of a woman who knew she had reclaimed her power. We will see, she said, echoing the words she had once spoken to him. And for the first time in a long while, Jabari believed that their future was filled with hope. The lesson had been painful, but it had taught them all one undeniable truth: true strength does not come from control or pride. It comes from love, unity, and the courage to change. And with that understanding, they walked forward, together.